All right, welcome back to another installment of our online Bible study. We've been working our way through the book of Daniel, specifically looking at passages where Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are encountering some challenges associated with living in Babylon. They've been exiled from Jerusalem, from the place that they called home, taken to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar. And what we see is they're living kind of a countercultural life. That means that the culture of the day is not the Christian culture, the Jewish culture, the Hebrew culture that they're used to. And so the new culture worships different gods. They have different ideas about what to eat and how to do things. And they have challenges associated with that. And so I thought that that would be helpful for us to look at some ways in which they dealt with that, because sometimes living in America as Christians, we face challenges also with, if we live our lives according to the Bible and what God says for us to do, then we're going to realize that our lives are not always culturally acceptable. The thoughts that we have, the beliefs that we share, our practices are not shared by everybody else. And I'm not saying necessarily that that involves persecution, but it does involve us deciding when we have to do what we think we have to do according to what we're called by God to be doing. And so today we're going to dive into Daniel chapter 5, which is going to be fun. Next week we'll have chapter 6. Next week is Daniel in the Lion's Den, which is in many ways connected specifically to this passage today. And so chapter 5 is interesting. We call the story The Handwriting on the Wall. And we're going to dive in just a minute, but there's difficulties involved with this story, with a lot of others, but in the book of Daniel specifically, some of the challenges in understanding what it is that we're talking about are, we're going back around 2,500 years, well over 2,000 years, to look at a situation that's not our culture. And by that I mean the Hebrew culture is not our culture, the language is not our language. They used words and phrases that we don't. Even if you went back 500 years in English, it'd be very difficult to tell what everybody was saying. But to go back over 2,000 years to another language, to another country. But then you have the challenge of Daniel and his friends being exiled out of Jerusalem into Babylon. That's a challenge. So you have other languages at play. So we read the book of Daniel in English, but it was really written in Hebrew. But a lot of the words are foreign origin words from Aramaic and other languages. And then in our lesson today, the Babylonians get overtaken by the Medes and the Persians, which introduces a new set of languages. And so when all of this is written down, a lot of the language terms that we use have origins in different languages. And so if you trace back the use of a particular word, that's difficult. Not only that, but sometimes the way that those languages are written, like Hebrew and other Aramaic, other Semitic languages, they didn't write the languages like we do in that time period. In other words, so if you look at Hebrew, in those times, what they would do is put the consonants together. There would not be vowels written within the line. So if you look at a modern Hebrew translation of the Bible, you'll see there are dots and dashes for vowels above and below the line. Not only that, but there are times when they didn't make distinctions for spaces in between words. And so because of the scrolls that they were written on and the different parchments, which were extraordinarily valuable, they try to get the most out of that they could. And we'll see some of the challenges associated with understanding that today. So, as a pastor, I believe the book of Daniel as it's written. But what we have to do is understand that there are times when it's written using words that we need to understand what they mean in order to say. Because people look at the 5th chapter of the book of Daniel as a means of discrediting Daniel, as a means of saying, well, this is obviously make-believe, it didn't happen. And we'll go through some of that. At the end of the day, we really want to know what is it that Daniel encountered, what the challenges are that he faced. That would help us today. But in doing so, we're going to dive into some of the kind of things that are interesting to look at when we go back over 2,000 years to look at something that was written then. So let's dive in to the book of Daniel. right, so as we dive into the book of Daniel chapter 5, if you want to grab your Bible, certainly welcome to do so. We're going to do like we have in the past. I'm going to read a few verses and talk about it. But this chapter has, in the middle of it, some things that we're just going to summarize. So we're going to read some of the verses at the beginning and the end, and then some of the chapters in between, some of the verses in between. I'm just going to give you like a little running summary of all of those in the interest of spending the most time on the most interesting part of it. And so let's begin by starting in Daniel chapter 5. We'll begin reading in verse 1. So King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, and that the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, his concubines drank from them, and they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. It's interesting, some of the things that we pick up just at the beginning. We left off the last chapter with Nebuchadnezzar regaining his sanity in many ways from having spent some time out with the wild animals. And then chapter 5 just puts us into another story, and it's Belshazzar, not to be confused with what they called Daniel, which was Belteshazzar, but Belshazzar, and it calls him king. Now, if you go back, we have some helps in studying this, in that there's some Babylonian historical things that have been written in all of these things, but also, again, here's where some of the words matter. King for us means the top, the one ruler, the person in charge. King in this situation maybe was not that way, because even though the story in Daniel only tells us about Nebuchadnezzar, who's called the father in this story, and Belshazzar, who would be his son, there's actually, if we look at the history of the, and I'm not saying that the Bible is not true, I'm saying that the Bible has used certain words, and we need to be careful when we look at those words, what they mean and don't. King and father being two of them here, son. In that time period, king meant a ruler. Not necessarily the king, but a ruler. And so when we talk about Belshazzar being a king, what we have to do is set aside the fact that we think of king as he's the only one king. You know, the only way to become king is to kill the other king. And also the father could also mean, for example, in the Old Testament, they say, well, our fathers are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And what they meant was our ancestors in some way. But you could say fathers to refer to other people. Going back to the other historical records, we know that there was Nebuchadnezzar, but then Nabonidus was his son, and then Belshazzar was Nabonidus' son. And so we have another character in there, but the Bible story doesn't feel led to tell us about that, and the Bible story doesn't really include him as a character because he doesn't play into this story. So what other people have said when looking at the book of Daniel, they didn't know Nabonidus was there. And so what I'm saying to you is it doesn't matter. The words used could mean that Belshazzar was probably the viceroy, probably second in charge. Incidentally, when we see the writing on the wall and he's making an offering, he's offering to people to be the third person in charge of all of Babylon. He can't offer two because he's two, and then Nabonidus, his dad, would have been the person. But so when it calls him king, he is a ruler. He's probably the one who's in charge and actually ruling, and Nabonidus is in a different location altogether. And when we see the Medes and the Persians at the end of the chapter take over, they're taking over Belshazzar, which is recorded the story in historical books. So he is the one who is ruling, even though he might not be king in the way that we think a king. In Aramaic, there more than likely more than one word. In fact, I was looking at two different words for king. One of them meant king, like Nebuchadnezzar was the king. He was the top. He was the only one. But Belshazzar here uses a different word for king, and it probably is just talking about him being a ruler. So again, a lot of people have used this passage to say discredit the Bible, if that could be possible. The Bible is not being discredited here as a historical marker because it's not trying to tell history of the Babylonian people. It's trying to tell the story of Daniel. And it's also saving room by not including a character who's not in there, but it's also using terms father to mean grandfather perhaps, king to mean ruler perhaps. in a way that everybody who would have read it during that time would have probably understood that. And so we have to step back and say, okay, wait a minute. Let's look at that a minute and see what it says. But what Belshazzar does is what his father did, or his grandfather. Nabonidus may have done the same thing. And that is, he got a little too big for his britches. In other words, he began to act as if he was the one in charge and he was God. But God is God. And so one of the things that people forget in life is when they try to take on more than they should, is that they should not step over God in doing that. In fact, idolatry is described in the Old Testament as putting anything in front of God. And so what we see is Belshazzar is sitting there, he's having a feast, 1,000 people involved. He's eating and drinking, and he gets to this place in his eating and drinking where he gets a little more bold what he wants to do, and he's thinking, hey, we got all of these fancy gold goblets and things. Now, incidentally, when Nebuchadnezzar would go into a land and when he would take over the gold and all that, why not melt it down to make his statue? Why not melt it down to make other things? But these were spiritual objects, and at some point, they kept them aside and remembered. There are a lot of things that they don't remember, but they do remember that these were taken out of the temple. So whether you would say God didn't allow him to do it, or God placed on his heart that he shouldn't do it, he set them aside to a special place. They were reserved. They were not within the realm of what Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar should play around with. They took them from the temple in Jerusalem. They tore down the temple. They did those things. But probably be careful, because God is God. Belshazzar said, I'm God. I'm going to put my seat in and necessarily say I'm God, because he's not God. He knows that. But he also said, hey, listen, I'm not going to let one puny God, So what he does is he takes those things and he uses it to drink to the other gods, the polytheistic things that they would study. Already in the story, you see trouble for poor Belshazzar. We barely get introduced to the poor guy, and already he's making big mistakes. How big? As we keep reading, we'll figure that out. So let's pick up in the next few verses. In chapter 5, it says, immediately the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. So it was a well-lit area on a wall that people could see. And it said the king saw the hand as it wrote. Now this would be kind of scary if you saw it in that way. And so the reaction of the king, we see the king's color changed. It probably went pale. And his thoughts alarmed him. What in the world is going on? His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together. So the king called loudly to bring in the enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers. The king declared to the wise men of Babylon, whoever is able to read this writing and shows me the interpretation shall be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then all the king's wise men came in, but they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. And Belshazzar, the king Belshazzar, was greatly alarmed, and his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. We see several things happening in these short few verses. Belshazzar is doing something that he ought to know is wrong, that his father didn't even do. And so a short-term memory of what's dangerous is a very difficult thing. And we see him offending God in a very deep way. Items that were consecrated to the temple of the holy God were being used to worship other gods. It wasn't as if they were just eating, drinking, and being merry, although that's offensive to God too. They're using those things consecrated to the one and only God to worship other gods. And so God says to God's self, I've had enough of that. So he sends down a hand, and it says it had the likeness of a human hand, and it begins to scroll on a wall. And so he's able to see live as somebody's writing on the wall. Now, we grew up in times of computer graphics, and we see in film depictions of all kinds of things. And so to us, that might not be unsettling. To him, it was greatly unsettling. In fact, it tells us in the process of this happening that his color changed. It said that twice. So he got pale, lost all of his colors if the blood's rushing from his brain. And then it says it happened again. So he's even more pale. He's, oh my goodness, what's going on here? And something is written in inscription. Again, what I would say is that there's a good chance that the words that we understand, mean, tekel, upharsin, which we're going to see in a minute, were written just as consonants. It's not like they were being hidden, but without the vowels associated with them, without the words. They were just a series of letters. And so somebody came in and he said, okay, let's find all the wise men to interpret this. And he's not able to find any. And then he becomes even more afraid. he becomes even more scared. And looking around, you can see even some of the people in his company begin to feel the same thing. So the wise men come and the wise men go. And he makes this promise. He said, whoever can read the writing, show me its interpretation, be clothed in purple. One of the reasons why purple is so valuable in that time is because it's scarce. The dyes to make purple, Lydia was a dealer of purple, is an indication that she was wealthy in the New Testament. But it was rare, and so usually you would find the dyes needed to make purple garments were reserved for royalty. And so then he says gold chain. There was probably some kind of significance associated with that. You know, when we have somebody who becomes a ruler, president, or something, we see their face, we know who they are. In those times, you didn't have those kind of depictions, and so they would wear something to indicate their stature. And so probably the gold chain was that, the purple would have been that. And then he says again, he could give them the third most powerful leader in the land. Well, he can't give away two if he's two, and he can't give away one because his dad, maybe King Emeritus at the time, halfway retired, and so he begins to look around the kingdom. Now, incidentally, Daniel enters the story right after these few verses, and I'll summarize those in a little bit because it talks about the queen coming in. Again, it could have been the queen mother. It could have been somebody of the older generation who remembered Daniel. There are, in my reading, indications that Daniel was probably in his 80s at this time. So Daniel's not even in the list of people that they bring in. He's kind of been retired, as if Belshazzar said, "I don't need you anymore. You're the old." You know, he was his grandfather's wise man. And so at this point he's saying, okay, Mr. Outdated One. He's not even considering the dude. But the queen remembers. Now, look, when your grandfather, of your fathers, of your ancestors, when Nebuchadnezzar saw him, he found him to be exceptionally wise. And so he could tell you what's going on here. If you want to call him in, he will give you all of the things that you need to know. And so the queen remembers. Even though all the people in that time period don't necessarily remember who Daniel is. So Daniel's still living in the area, and he's still active in some way in worshiping God and doing all the things. He still has the gifts. And so they decide to call him in. You know, he's able to interpret dreams. He's, they explain to Belshazzar all the things that Nebuchadnezzar said about him. He's in the spirit of the gods, and all of that. Although we would say that's not a description of somebody. He's a prophet of the living God. They didn't understand it that way. And so they call in Daniel. And so I'll skip a few of the verses, but Daniel comes in and he says, we want you to interpret this. And of course, for Daniel, it's no big deal. Because God's on his side. It's not because God has given him gifts, but the biggest gift God gave Daniel was God's presence and God's spirit to be able to do all of these things. So Daniel's not relying on some smartness that he has, but if God sends a dream, he can interpret the dream because God can send the interpretation to Daniel. And so he basically tells Belshazzar, keep your gold, keep your purple, keep all of those things. I don't want any of that, but I'll tell you. I'll go ahead and tell you what it is. And the interpretation is not friendly to Belshazzar. Daniel's used to that already. But this time it's more grave. And for Daniel to risk telling Belshazzar a prophetic word, a prophecy, the interpretation of the writing, that inscribes the end of one ruling party and the beginning of another is a risky thing for Daniel. Because again, he's safe in this one. When the other ones come in, how do you usually become king? You kill the king. But how do you, fare if you're a prophet? How do you fare if you're third in line? And so Daniel's like, keep the third in line stuff for now. This may be a temporary thing. And if you try to put yourself in those situations, the tension of that moment has to be intense. But it's nothing new for Daniel. He's been through that before. So let's pick up reading again in the next few verses. We pick up reading in verse 22. And so this is when, Daniel's told him, there's some hard things coming. And Daniel spends a few times in the middle of the chapter reminding him about the whole situation with Nebuchadnezzar, where he got a little too big for his britches, we would say in the South, and where God sent him out again to run around with the animals. And he tells Belshazzar in verse 22, and you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this. So Nebuchadnezzar fell because of his lack of humility. And then he says, you, Belshazzar, you knew the same thing, and here's what you've done. You have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven, and the vessels of his house have been brought in before you. You and your lords and your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, stone, which you do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored. You've not honored. So it's an interesting place that Daniel puts Belshazzar in. You've not remembered history. Of the things that you should have remembered, you've not remembered. The things that you could take lightly, you take seriously, and the things that you should take very seriously. The God in who holds your breath in his hands, you've forsaken for other. And he says he set himself against God in that way by taking the vessel. So it's interesting to me, they call Daniel, this party's going on, and Daniel walks in, and Daniel looks around. And it seems like Daniel, at least in some way, shape, or form, is familiar with the things that were consecrated to his God. When the captivity happened, it might have been Daniel and his friends who brought those things to Nebuchadnezzar, to Babylon, for safekeeping. They may have been charged with transporting those valuable things to the next place. But he walks in, he looks around, and Daniel knows already what's going on. He doesn't even bring up the words that are written on the wall yet. And yet the attitude of somebody who's against God is well known. So we pick back up in verse 24. Then from his presence, the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. So he tells them how it happened. And he said, this is the writing that was inscribed. Min, tekel, parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Min is God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Now he repeats that, so it's mean, so it's twice. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances and found wanting. And Perez, or parson, so he's using two different words. A parson is two Perez, which is a weight term. Your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. So it's interesting here that Daniel is able to see the writing on the wall. He knows what it means, mean, tekel, parson. And so each of those three words is associated with weights. It's associated with scales. So if you're weighing something, you go you want to buy, in our scale system, maybe you want to buy a pound of beans or a pound of rice or a pound of fish or a pound of whatever. And they would put the pound thing on the scale, and they would put your fish or whatever it is you're buying, the rice or beans, on the other side. And when they're even, that's when you know you're getting a pound. And if it was an ounce, they would take off and they'd put an ounce, or maybe they'd have a 5 ounce, or maybe they'd have something else, and they'd put it in the weights. And I have a picture that I want to share with you that I saw online that had the different weights and measures that would be associated with that time. And so you'd have a scale, you'd put that on it, and then you would see it. And so what you could see, if you look at the picture, is several units of measurement. And they were the mina, the shekel, and the perez. The perez is twice, meaning two of those are meaning a parson, and so parson is 2 perez, and then the shekel, and then the mina, which is a way of saying mean, and so those are all weights and measures. And so what Daniel says is, I found the meaning of the 3 words written there. Mean was twice, and that is your days have been numbered, because the number was at the beginning, and then you've been measured and found wanting, and your days are over. And so what he does, and this is something that's interesting in those times, he first, when he reads the words, he reads them as units of measurement or weight, and then he analyzes what those mean to say, okay, this one means number, your days are numbered. This one means weight, you've been found in the balance, and you've been wanting. And so, he's got to then interpret that, and that's part of the way that people would have looked at that and said, wow, that makes a lot of sense, and Daniel would have been smart. The other thing is, weights and measures had archaeologists found that they had astrological meanings sometimes. And so in the first groups of people who are astrologers, and so when they looked at those weights and things, they would have seen, okay, how you number your days and all of that was connected to the weights and measures. And all of those things would have meant that Daniel all the things that Daniel said everybody in the room would have known, had some validity, that he was putting some things together that made sense. And so let's move on and read the last little bit, because the last little bit really tells us a whole lot. He said that night, so wait a minute, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes. Then Belshazzar gave the command, verse 29, and Daniel was clothed in purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be the third ruler in all the kingdom. And that very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean was killed. Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And so let's look at what's happening here. And other people would say, okay, Darius the Mede is not a person written about in any of the Babylonian things, but Cyrus the Great is. In one place in the book of Daniel says Darius the Mede. In other words, Cyrus the Great. Darius the Mede was one way of talking about Cyrus the Great. So again, we have to understand what we're saying, and I'm not trying to make the Bible agree with history. What I'm trying to say is that the way the Bible said things and the historical record are really one. And so the historical records really reinforce a lot of the things that the book of Daniel says. So to go back that many years and have books from two perspectives really saying the same thing. But a lot of people say, well, it says Darius. Well, Darius was a way of referring to Cyrus in many ways. And a lot of that has to do with how people were referred according to different languages. And so we see that in different countries. Your name might be pronounced differently. But one of the interesting things is it says that very night. Now, if you go back and read the historical records of how Babylon fell, the stories talk about a big party. The stories talk about Belshazzar being killed. They talk about some of them talk about Nabonidus being killed, but some of them talk about him going off to exile. And again, the Bible doesn't feel the need to describe what happened to Nabonidus, and so it doesn't mention him. It mentions the son and the father, which again are interchangeable in that language with grandson and grandfather, even though they're not in ours. Our languages, English tends to be much more precise than some of the other languages on purpose. Although it hasn't always been that way, it grows towards more preciseness because, as Americans, we value that. In other cultures, they value connection. And if so, somebody was your grandfather saying you're the son of so-and-so was acceptable. But what it says is the Medes and the Persians, is they were kind of waiting outside the city. And they needed to get in, and there was a wall around the area where they were. So they're having this great party, 1,000 people invited, and they're partying in the midst of an enemy attack. And if you go back and look at that at the beginning, maybe an indication of something, another character flaw in Belshazzar, that he was willing to have his drink be many and then keep drinking in a way that compromised his ability to make proper decisions, and that he thought maybe they would never be able to break into the wall. What happens is that there's a river going under the wall, and they're able from the inside or from the outside, I'm not exactly sure, but to divert water away from the river so that they're able to crawl under the wall on the riverbed. And so they pop up, and then boom, there they are, and they're able to kill Belshazzar and all that. Daniel perhaps is also aware of the fact that the enemies are all around, and here they are partying. And then instead of seeking the help of the Lord their God, what do? They go out and they go to the temple, and they find all of these things that are consecrated to God, and they use them in an unconsecrated way. And so Daniel's like, no, seriously, don't make me number 3. It's interesting that Belshazzar goes ahead and makes him number 3 and puts out a proclamation to who we don't know, because he dies that very night. It wasn't a next day thought out thing. Maybe in terms of trying to appease God, but at that point it's too late. At that point, appeasing God is out the door. And so we see the Babylonian captivity becomes the Assyrian captivity, the Persian captivity. And Daniel's all of a sudden up in the air. Now chapter 6 solves that for Daniel, what happens to him. But Belshazzar has made multiple mistakes in the face of his enemy. Because maybe he thinks that, his grandfather was strong enough, Nebuchadnezzar was strong enough to make people fear, but he wasn't. And so there's a generational gap in how Belshazzar reacts, but in many ways God has just removed. He handed the king of Israel over to Nebuchadnezzar, but God kept being insulted, so he says, okay, well, I'll take that away and I'll give it to another group. And the captivity then continues because the time is not up from what we read next time of how, after that, actually, chapter 7, how long the captivity is supposed to last. The years have not yet been accomplished. And so God then picks another secular leader to continue to teach Israel the lesson of unfaithfulness. And so you see Israel worshiping another god is what got them in here. And then Belshazzar worshiping other gods with consecrated things to our God, to the most holy God, are the things that got him removed and killed and picked apart. And so you see there, kind of right there at the end, that all of the things go south. And it's left with Daniel's the third in the land, but Darius the Mede, who we think again was Cyrus the Great, received the kingdom, and he was about 62 years old. So that night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. So the ruler is gone, and they've replaced him. So what will happen to Daniel? There's an idea that Daniel brought this intense word from God to him about his time being over. And we don't really get a sense of what's for Daniel. Maybe when they come in and they kill Belshazzar, oh, he's got the gold and the purple on at the very wrong time. Daniel has not enjoyed the benefits of wearing the purple hat in public and having the gold chain and all of these things. He gets it just in time for the second in command to be killed. What's going to happen to the third in command? And the idea is that sometimes Daniel, when he was in Babylon, he had to do the right thing no matter what. And when you get a sense next week, when we study chapter 6, is Daniel in the lion's den. It's just who Daniel was. His character was defined as he was loyal to his God. He was going to do whatever he needed to do, despite whatever the cost was. And there's a sense that Daniel, living in the counterculture of the day, decided that it wasn't worth it to cross God for the sake of whoever. He was going to stay faithful to God. Our God is able to save us, but even if he doesn't. That was his motto and their motto, the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And the point of this whole story and the point of next week and all of that is our God can deliver us from whatever it is when we're in a culture, as long as we honor him and worship him in the way. And then the people who get in trouble are the people who cross God, who do things that are sacrilegious and that contaminate the holiness of God. And so what we're going to do is we're going to drop that off today. We're going to pick up next week, which again is when you start reading into chapter 6, it's connected to this week. And we'll see how Daniel fares. It turns out God is able to take care of Daniel on multiple levels. So next week will be a good one, probably our last in the book of Daniel in terms of the stories of Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But I hope you're doing well and found this to be an interesting story. The writing was on the wall. And Daniel offered the interpretation at the right time. So I look forward to seeing you again next week. Until then, God bless you.